Hello, everyone. My name is Arif Jamal. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies, or CALS, at the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, and a co-convener, along with my colleague, Dr. Dian Seow, of the Law and Religion Cluster at CALS. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Law and Religion Cluster Speakers Series event that we're holding today, where we are delighted to have the opportunity to discuss the book Post-Liberal Religious Liberty by Dr. Joel Harrison of Sydney Law School at the University of Sydney. And we are especially happy to have Dr. Harrison here with us. So welcome, Joel, and thank you for being present. We also have the pleasure of having two commentators on the book, Dr. Tan Seo Hon of the Young Pa Hao School of Law at Singapore Management University, and Dr. Daniel Go of the Department of Sociology at NUS. Thank you, Seo Hon and Daniel, for participating in today's event, and welcome. I will be the moderator for our discussion, and I will invite Seo Hon first and then Daniel to offer their remarks on the book for about 15 minutes or so each, and then give a chance for Joel to respond to their remarks. Thereafter, we will open up the discussion for general questions from all of the attendees in the seminar, which I will then moderate and direct to our panelists. So just a note, please, that we are using the Zoom webinar function for this webinar. So please use the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of the screen for your questions. And you can also upvote questions that you particularly find interesting using this function. Okay, so without further ado, welcome again to everyone, and let me invite Seo Hon to kick us off with her comments. Seo Hon, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much to Arif and Dian for inviting me for this talk. I found the book to be a very delightful read, Joel, right before marking my exam scripts. And I found it to be refreshing, especially when you set out what you note is a theopolitical imaginary, and you put forth an account which you say will not persuade those who subscribe to public reason. I thought that's a very nice kind of statement. And I found it refreshing how you try to make sense of why religious liberty tends to be treated the way that is treated nowadays. Now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I hope that it doesn't disappoint Arif that I'm not going to be speaking so much on religious liberty in a constitutional sense. I'm going to comment on a few things that I think are interesting from a more jurisprudential point of view. So I'll use simple slides as the background. I know this is a somewhat informal, a sort of a chat, but I'll just use the slides because I know that some of the audience may not have read the book, so it's easier to follow. Now, I think that there are three main points that I want to discuss with Joel today, and I thought that I'll preface it with two little things. The first is when I was invited and I saw the title of the book, and it says Post-Liberal Religious Liberty, Forming Communities of Charity. I was thinking that I was being invited to speak on charitable organizations and the kind of religious liberty challenges they face. So I really smiled when I saw the later part of the book when Joel mentioned that charity has really lost its deep and rich meaning in the Christian tradition today, that we've forgotten the deeper and richer meaning that is found in the Christian tradition. And we tend to think of charity as just helping the poor, which is actually very troubling. And because it means that Joel's project is highly countercultural, and it's probably an uphill task, and he does such a commendable piece of work here. Now, I'm personally sympathetic, and that's my second matter in the preface, which is that I'm personally sympathetic to many of the ideas affirmed in the book. And I do agree that, for example, that Rawls' idea of public reason is not neutral amongst different ideas of the good. I agree with the overemphasis on the primacy of autonomy nowadays. I also like Joel's discussion of how there is some assumption that when a religious organization is doing a public or outward-facing act, then it's performing a public service, and it just follows that the state rightfully regulates whatever it's doing. Now, I think that too readily forecloses the issue, and it assumes that it's really a matter for the state, and the state is the one delegating the task. So I like all these discussions. I also especially am partial to the ideals of solidarity, fraternity, and charity. I think that they are salutary and appropriate ends that have a strong directive power for human associations, for human endeavors. And so in that sense, the comments I'm going to make are really, they're really stemming from curiosity rather than disagreement. I think that I face some of these difficulties also on some of my own projects. So I want to draw upon Joel's insights on these questions that I have. Okay, so I have three main points. I'm going to talk about the plurality of groups in Joel's ecclesiological account, Joel's treatment of the ideal of true religion, and I'm also going to ask Joel a little bit about the understanding of religious liberty based upon Finness's basic value of religion and how his account compares with this. Okay, so let's move on to the first point, which is the plurality of groups in the ecclesiological account. Now, I mean, the plurality of groups also underlies the doctrine of subsidiarity affirmed by the natural law theorists. And the idea is that there are primary units such as the family, and some speak of them as pre-existing the state. And all these different associations are important. At the same time that we are citizens in the state, we're also members of these different associations, and they have important roles to play in human flourishing. So the polity isn't the only important association. Now, to the extent that you very much focus on the end of communities of charity, I wonder whether there might be a different angle of a challenge that you might face nowadays, not so much directly from the religious liberty kind of angle, but more from how alternative associations are popping up everywhere. And these are probably regarded as important for their members. So I'm thinking of, say, alternative non-heteronormative family structures. So how would we deal with this fact that, these units are viewed as primary, also they're important for flourishing. So I'm wondering whether the case that you build for religious liberty based upon plural sites of authority indirectly would lend some credence to the arguments for the need to promote alternative associations, that these alternative non-heteronormative family structures are equally important. So that's my first sort of a discussion point. My second discussion point is with respect to the ideal of true religion. So maybe just for the sake of the audience, I can give a quick summary. Hopefully it's not too inaccurate. Now, you say that true religion is the basis for religious liberty, and religious liberty is really protecting the quest for true religion. And true religion leads to an understanding of one's place in relation to God and in relation to other people. So it orientates one into right ordering, and it furthers the communities of solidarity, fraternity, and charity. So what is happening is that the polity is being directed towards these ends. And you acknowledge that the basis for rights and for religious liberty rights would be a Christian basis in your account. But these rights would enable people also to pursue other religions, because these are also quests for true religion in that sense. So people can be protected even if they want to pursue other religions, as they're also forming communities to seek God. So I have three little questions here. The first is, given Christianity's exclusive truth claims, I'm wondering whether there are certain manifestations of other religions that are likely to be rejected. So in other words, might it be the case that they're not protected under the notion of religious liberty? So for example, what if a religious tradition rejects at its heart the idea of equal moral worth? Say, for example, women are regarded as the property of their husbands or their fathers, or say caste systems such as the Burakumin in Japan or in associated Hinduism. Now, I know, of course, that there may be some debate as to whether caste systems are, supported by any religious text at all, and they may be political in origin more than anything. But just in case there's a religious tradition which rejects such equal dignity, would the basis of religious liberty in Christianity then lead to the rejection of protection of such practices? My second question is, I think you're suggesting that some are claiming an equivalent protection for deeply held non-religious ethical beliefs. And we shouldn't move towards such a capacious understanding of religious liberty. So how would you answer someone who's not so much claiming a personal, sincere, a deep, authentic ethical belief, but is actually claiming that even though he subscribes to atheism, this is part of an organized atheistic religion or an organized secular humanism, and he's actually working towards a community to debunk the existence of God, so that human beings can be freed from all superstitions And only when they are freed from such superstitions can they truly flourish. And a true potential can be realized when we acknowledge that we live in a universe that is entirely materialistic. So in that sense, might there be some adherents of such an organized atheism who suggest that, we are truly committed to flourishing communities as well? So my third little question is, sub-question is this. Insofar as religious practices matter within your account, and religious practices are found within religious traditions, would the account actually give any place for the evolution of religious tradition? So might certain religious practices come about only later? Would they be deserving of protection? Whose evidence or testimony do we look at if there are different splinter groups that emerge that hold dear a particular portion of the sacred text but reject the rest? So these are my questions under the second discussion point. And then I move on to the third discussion point, which is looking at how you discuss religious liberty based on the basic good of religion. So I think that there's some comments that you make about Finnis's idea of the basic good of religion. And you suggested that religion for Finnis is one of several basic goods. And these basic goods are all equally fundamental. They are essential for human flourishing. And from the basic goods, we can work out human rights. And the scope of the rights would, I think, be circumscribed by the practical reasonableness principles. Now, you note that Finnis wouldn't really be bothered about the differentiation of spheres, because within a secular society, Finnis would still be able to effect this theory in the sense that individuals can pursue their goods, they can still be governed by the rules of practical reasonableness. And the practices of religion are secondary in his account. So he's not so much looking at the practices of religion within a religious tradition. And also he frames religion very broadly, because the basic good of religion essentially is just about encouraging people to grasp metaphysical questions, to engage with metaphysical stuff, even if they come to a negative conclusion. So that might, potentially lead to some authenticity claims being protected. So I was thinking about some of these points, and I was wondering whether we might come to the same outcome. So it's not so much because I note that you discussed Finnis and you looked at how he would deal with the claims of, say, the case of Catholic Care, where an adoption agency refuses to place children with LGBTQ plus family units. So he discusses it as a matter of association and so on. So I'm not looking at how he discusses it, but what we can infer from his theory. Okay, so I was wondering whether I can run this by you. So suppose that we might it be possible to say that we wouldn't end up with a capacious understanding of religion or religious liberty that elevates, the protection of deeply held convictions of any kind? Okay, and the reason is this, because even though the goods are equally fundamental, they are only equally fundamental in the sense that we would be missing out on something, some aspect of human flourishing if we did not pursue them. But it doesn't mean that religion does not have a special status. You see, in Finnis's other article on the practical meaning of secularism, he's clearly against the sort of constitutional neutrality in the understanding of constitutional rights. So constitutional rights are not founded upon autonomy of individuals. We're not looking at respecting everybody's choice, but the basic goods have a certain directive power. So this means that if you acknowledge that there's just for the sake of the audience, if you acknowledge that there's a right to life, then symmetrically, there would be a right to terminate life if you focus on autonomy. If you have the right to beget a child, then you would have the right to terminate a pregnancy if you focus on a symmetrical understanding of rights and you focus on constitutional neutrality and you emphasize autonomy. But Finnis rejects that, and he looks instead towards the directive power of the basic goods. So if you have a right to life, it is in service of the good of life. If you have a right to beget a child, it's in service of the right, is the good of life through procreation, and maybe the good of sociability, acting for the good of the child. So there's a reference to the goods to understand the scope of the rights. Now, in that sense, I was thinking about how religious convictions and practices would then feature in this account. So if we are thinking about the right to religious liberty, freedom of religion, if you're thinking about that, then it is meant to serve the good of religion. And I was thinking that the deep convictions that are merely ethical and non-religious in nature would possibly fit better under Finnis's basic value of practical reasonableness. And if you look at practical reasonableness, then it's clear that Finnis is not into the Planned Parenthood and Casey sort of sweet mystery of life kind of autonomy. He's not thinking that everybody has the right to define their own existence, the meaning of life, the mystery of human life, the meaning of the universe, and so on. So instead, he suggests that, you know, practical reasonableness is, I mean, I guess it's at best the idea of autonomy constrained by reason. So given that he's not into, you know, unlimited autonomy or autonomy limited only by the autonomy of someone else, given that he's not into these ideas, if we fit deep ethical beliefs under the category of practical reasonableness and know that it is not an unlimited autonomy, then how do we make sense of a case like Masterpiece Cake Shop, where the baker refuses to bake a cake to celebrate a gay wedding because he thinks that that amounts to an endorsement of a gay wedding? Or, you know, the Catholic Care case where a Catholic adoption agency refuses to place children with LGBTQ plus families. Now, how to make sense of these cases? Might we say that, the baker and the agency wish to act in view of their religious beliefs? And the only question for Finnis, which I think you discussed also, the only question for Finnis would be whether or not some good is damaged. So I think you note that Finnis then has the difficulty of proving that, you know, it's the good of sociability somehow damaged, that these families are not serving the good of sociability. Perhaps that's why he introduces the good of marriage as one of the goods, you know, the 8th good on top of the 7th good. And he has that difficulty. But I was wondering whether in any case, you know, I mean, we're either faced with that difficulty or the other difficulty, you know, associated with a more directly ecclesiological account anyway, that, you know, there would be challenges from alternative primary units, alternative associations that emerge. So it's just a different kind of difficulty, but, you know, it doesn't mean that, it's not a difficulty that results from a capacious understanding of religious liberty under Finnis's scheme in that sense. Okay, so I think that's it for my comments. I look forward to discussion later.
Thanks, Johan. Thank you very much. Let me now ask Daniel if he could give us his comments. Daniel.
Hi, hello, thank you. Thanks, Joe, for a most exciting book. I'm going to preface my comments by first saying that I'm approaching this as a sociologist, but also subconsciously as a Catholic. And a lot of it, I was just telling Arif before this that this book really helped me to reconnect with my Catholic theological kind of explorations and philosophizing in the past. So let me begin with the first comment, and this starts with the title of the book, and actually basically the premise of criticizing post-liberalism, or not to criticize post-liberalism, but to participate in the kind of post-liberal debates about liberalism. So I'm wondering whether your task, your project, is really a post-liberal project, or is it a recovery of some kind of alternative model that I felt maybe was once historically possible. And I was just thinking of sociologists like T.H. Marshall, who wrote about citizenship and social citizenship in the starting of welfare states. And a lot of these welfare state institutions were really spurred by social gospel, or even before that, basically Christian Catholic kind of thinking about how to repair the liberal model in its market-focused policies. So I'm wondering whether that is actually a recovery of an alternative model that was historically possible, rather than a post-liberal debate. And my thinking is more like, if we are, I can understand why there's a need to kind of participate in the post-liberal debate, but I feel that the biggest elephant in the room actually is neoliberalism, and how it it actually forces us to kind of deal with neoliberalism and its effect on the world. And more on that later. The second point is again something to do with historical possibilities, and I'm wondering whether there are actually existing political systems that come close actually to looking like the Augustinian community of communities. Because as I was reading through the book as a sociologist, I'm saying, wow, this really looks like Singapore. Is Singapore that utopia that your project is kind of looking for? Except with one exception, which I'll come to. And so in that sense, would this kind of fall under the kind of Asian communitarian ideology? And is there a difference between your model and Asian communitarianism? I know a lot of commentators have commented and tried to describe the Singapore system as variously Durkheimian, Hegelian, even Rawlsian. But I think it would be really interesting to kind of describe it as Augustinian. Anyway, okay, so the next comment I have is and this follows on the Singapore comment, is what is the role and where's the place of the state in the ecclesiological account of yours? I know in the liberal model, it's very minimalist, it's secure the rights of individuals, but I don't think you are edging towards the maximalist definition, right, of that role. And you indicate how, states could, or at least the courts could kind of, adjudicate on the basis, on a post-liberal basis, to secure the rights of, not the rights of individuals, but the words fail me, but the responsibilities of religious communities in securing, that good community, right? But what about the state itself, right? As an entity and institution within this entire model, and not just the courts. My following comments, more detailed comments, are actually on the chapter on St. Augustine and the model, which is my favorite chapter. Right. So on page 163, I was responding to your point about how neoliberalism, basically, you didn't really name it as neoliberalism, but neoliberalism and all the individualism that's caught up with it has been eroding communities, right? And so I'm wondering whether communities are already in inexorable decline, right? And so what can we do to reverse it or to rejuvenate it, right? And if they're already in inexorable decline, then what does it entail for a theory of community or charity, or community of communities of charity, right? Because we don't have those communities anymore. They are already in decline. They're almost gone, right? And this actually connects to a lot of concerns in Asian communitarian societies about westernization and individualization, and how these are eroding the basis of communal groups. So how do we then grow new communities? And how can religion, already facing its own decline in many of these societies, and becoming very individualistic? And so these are some of the comments that have been, criticisms of let's say, Pentecostal megachurches and the kind of religious marketplace Christianity that we are seeing happening across the global South, right? And how then do we ask, religion, can we place the burden on religious communities to pick up the slack and lead this renewal of communities? So when religion is already ossified by individualism and incapable of the task, so what do we do? And I think the state appears again, at least in the Singapore case, in which the Singapore state becomes in some ways the guarantor of community, of communal life, and tries to shore up communities when all this individualism and westernization is impacting on all the different communities, including religious communities. The next question I have is regarding page 165 about arbitration, right? So the problem of arbitration when a group's group's authority, right, a communal group's authority, is justified because it is grounded in the direction of the higher good. But who will be the arbiter of that justification, or whether it is grounded in direction of the higher good? Again, I have to bring in the Singapore state because it does the arbitration here. So religious groups, religious communities that do not orientate itself in the direction of what it thinks and it defines as the higher good, it will circumscribe their actions and even their registration or their existence as a community, right? So who does the arbitration ultimately? Can we trust a public sphere? And if we trust a public sphere and the kind of negotiation as you discussed in the last chapter, right, on pluralism and disagreements, can we trust it to come to a consensus about the direction of the higher good? Or what will we have is again a culture war that is being transported into another plane. All right. Next question. I love the relational definition of the person as opposed to the individual. I stand by that as a sociologist and a Catholic. Right? But there are of course issues, right? So can someone be less than a person does? I'm worried for such a definition because if you do not fulfill that relational definition, are you then therefore less a person? And would that mean that you have a lack that needs to be then that needs to be plugged in to be transformed, to be rehabilitated, by some kind of agency? And again, I'm thinking of the Singapore state, right, which says, there are people who are not married, they are single, we will try to get them to get married. And so they'll intervene into the private lives of people to try to get them to be persons, right? Because they're not seen as full persons if they don't get married. So the right to be alone, right, it disappears in this definition. So I'm kind of worried about that. Page 172, with a limited definition of religious liberty. Again, this goes back to the question of the decline of communities. Is this definition, this limited definition of religious liberty, enough given the decline of communities? And again, this is the issue of the public sphere and whether the public sphere can be the arbiter, right, of the definition of the higher good. Okay, two last questions, right? The second last question is about the family. Because a lot of your work is really based on the kind of Catholic, theology, and the Catholic Church is very concerned about the family and the decline of the family, the institution of the family, right? Because of individualization, because of liberalism, because of westernization, whatever, right? So and the family is not quite discussed as an institution or as a community or charity within the book. So would you consider the family as a community or charity? And what would be its special position? Because the Catholic Church does see as the primary community or charity, so to speak, that has to be that is the building block of society. And coincidentally, that's the view of the Singapore state too, right? So what is the position of the family in the communities of charity? My last question is, why Augustine? And because, I mean, Augustine lived in the 4th century, so it's very, at least temporally distant, right? Although his ideas, I think, are still very relevant, but he's temporally distant. And the criticism of liberalism, deals with the outcome of the post-Enlightenment kind of ideals that emerge in post-Renaissance Europe. Why not someone closer to the Renaissance or in the Renaissance, like Aquinas or even Erasmus, right? So why not these philosophers? Or maybe your next project is to kind of trace the lineage, the Augustinian lineage, right, that leads to your present kind of project. So these are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Lots of questions and comments, and I think both of the commentators will give Joel a lot to respond to. So let me turn the floor over to him. Joel.
Thank you so much. That is very, that's just wonderful and generous comments, and they're exciting to engage with, and just so much sort of percolating in my brain as you were both speaking. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to have people engaging with your work at that level of detail and with such mutual excitement as well. So thank you. I look to take just one step back and then dig into your points you've raised. So this as the questions from Daniel and Seow have raised, I think the book starts with that initial question of why should we care about religious liberty? Why should we care about this? There's a central debate in legal jurisprudential thinking in which a lot of what you call liberal egalitarian writers They think that it's essentially religious liberty is a category of, say, protecting authenticity or convictions of conscience or something like personal autonomy. And so we don't actually need to talk about religion in that sense. In Australia at the moment, we have a whole bunch of reviews, interminable number of reviews about religious liberty. And the constant refrain from people is that this is privileging religion over and above any other form of authenticity or any other form of conviction or any other form of authenticity personal autonomy and so on. And so then you get into questions like Seow raised about Catholic adoption agencies. Why should they be allowed to only serve, say, heterosexual couples when every other service provider has to not discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation and so on? Or even questions like why should somebody be exempted from a uniform requirement in relation to headdress when no one else gets to wear their own form of personal adornment and so on? Now, this is in the context as well as I think some of the comments have raised about then thinking about how religious liberty actually is fundamental to and helps us think about the nature of political authority and our political community. So this is part of the book as well. It's kind of, as I wrote it, it's about religious liberty and it's all doctrinal elements and theoretical elements. But then as I get further and further into the book, as the comments Daniel especially was raising, it gets much more into what is the nature of our life together. And how religious liberty and religion as a good actually shapes our life together. So I'm in contrast to, say, a writer like Ronald Dworkin, who says the res publica is about the political community is based on our shared interest in ethical individualism or a form of equal concern and respect, he says, right? Whereas in contrast, I say the fundamental contest centers with someone like Augustine, who says, no, that's not a real public life. A real public life is about a shared good in common, that you and I together as a community, we pursue goods in common, some common objects of love, some things that form us as a people together rather than forms of ethical individualism. Or as Daniel's quite rightly pointed out, what I see is just forms of essentially neoliberalism that are just complicit with a market orientation of all of life, right? It's very easy to say a focus on personal autonomy is not that all that distinct from a capitalist society, in which what is of value is determined by the individual supposedly in a system of market of supply and demand. So on my account, rather than personal autonomy, I say that religious liberty most fundamentally rests on the political community's commitment to religion. And then when we talk about religion, it's a case of saying, well, religion isn't just an abstract category. How we think about religion is quite historically and culturally contingent. And so I developed this out of Christian thought as to religion is about, in this case, forming communities of charity, solidarity, and fraternity, right? So this is very much housed within the Christian argument, but the Christian argument as that I think it has been quite influential in shaping arguments around nature of political community. So that's the basic overlay. And within that, you get a whole bunch of case law and things like this. But the questions that have been raised are just so interesting. I just want to go through each one in response if I can. So Seow raised about subsidiarity and its relationship in my argument. So I discuss how religious liberty is about the free creation of community as a solidarity community, solidarity, fraternity, and charity. And this one element of this is I talk about this being forming a community of communities. And this is laced throughout sort of Christian, and not just Christian thought, but laced throughout it. So Augustine talks about a communion in which you have kingdoms, cities, families, all of these together in an overlapping arrangement oriented around the basilica. Aquinas talks about the king necessarily supporting groups that have their own independent powers of operation. Althusius talks about politics, the end goal being association. Richard Hooker talks about the same sort of thing. And you get it, and then I talk about the social pluralists, 19th century into the 20th century figures in England, like especially John Neville Figgis. And I see this as a really important thread running through with the idea, when Daniel said, what's the role of the state? Well, the role of the state on this argument is that it supports and nourishes these communities, supports and nourishes those things that are already supportive and nourishing, right? The state is not absent because the state must exercise a coordinating authority, and the state must at times They must actually intervene, reach down into these organizations that can be oppressive and so on, must actually intervene. But there is a certain anti-statism within my argument, right? That the point is to create a more communitarian understanding, but one that is about the creativity, the personality, the giftings and talents of these sites, like unions, churches, like universities. So it's a part of that kind of more associational thinking generally. Now, the question was raised about what I do about alternative family structures and new kinds of association. Well, I think this is just an open, creative question. So it's interesting actually to think about one of the interesting things that people point to as the Pope's, one of his major powers during the height of the Pope's power was to create new corporations, right? So I'm not opposed to the idea that you have new things are created, new things like in a mutualist economy, like participatory schemes within corporate organizations, employees sitting on boards of companies and these sorts of things. If you're asking about particularly about alternative family structures, I try and actually discuss this a little bit in chapter, I'm going to get my numbers wrong, but chapter 6, where I try and actually discuss how I think you can have, within my understanding, you can have a sort of dualist understanding where you get people who disagree over a fundamental question like same-sex unions can nevertheless see themselves as still pursuing goods in common together. The ideal of true religion, really interesting question, I think, raised by both interlocutors here, that what do we do with a group that is, say, opposed to the equal moral worth of women? Now, part of me wants to simply answer, well, there's a sort of legal mind that thinks, well, you deal with things on limited facts, right? If a case arose in a particular limited context, you deal with it, and some law people just talk to you about proportionality on the particular case. Maybe we just isolate that particular practice, they continue otherwise. That's fine. It also seems unsatisfying, right, as an answer. So, I mean, I think that the basic point there is actually, no, we do exclude. We always do, and we necessarily must, in the sense that there must always be something that holds a privileged place of regulatory power, a privileged place of principled intervention. So at the moment, in religious liberty terms, what holds that place is typically an understanding of ethical individualism. So a lot of authors like Cecile Laborde or Richard Dawkins, or Ronald Dawkins and so on, they'll say things like, okay, once a church stops focusing in on its own parishioners, once it focuses on some undescribed public, then it is subject to all the interests of those individuals, right? So you get this in case like JFS in the United Kingdom. An Orthodox Jewish school had to accept into its school a Masorti Jewish student, even though the school said that this person was not Orthodox Jewish, was not Jewish on Orthodox grounds, had to accept him because he self-identified as Masorti, as Jewish, right? So that idea that the group is subject to the self-definition of individuals, the authenticity of individuals. And so there is an understanding already that dignity, or some people talk about in terms of dignity or in terms of individual authenticity, there's already something there that is imposing some sort of hemming in and regulative function. And so I'm suggesting there should be something that's actually more suited to building a society we want to live in, right? So this is part of my claim, is that the question is, what kind of society do we want to have? And so do we want a society that is community, as solidarity, fraternity, charity? And, this is a really difficult question. And I don't fully grapple with it, I think. By the end of the book, I start saying things like, on misconception, liberty is only truly liberty when it's oriented towards the good. And so what do we mean by that? Well, we must mean that sometimes there'll be groups that fall outside of this. We must be cautious of that, no doubt. But, if we had something that was actually, somebody wanting to impose coercively upon others elements of religious law, that would be, say, and when you talk about debates in the UK, that's seen as not permissible, right? To demand somebody must remain within a religious setting, for example, or to impose forms of particularly severe punishment in a religious context, things like this, right? Where you get that problematic conflating of, say, a religious authority suddenly exercises the coercive authority of temporal authority. That is, I think, still contrary to what I'm arguing in this case is a dominant thread in Christian thought. You can't avoid it, in other words. And this is part of what I'm saying is when I talk about the competing conceptions of true religion, right? Competing conceptions of how we understand religion. One is the liberal understanding of true religion. It's about the individual's authenticity. And the other one is what I'm proposing here. And that goes to Daniel's point about why do I go to Augustine? Right? Why do I go to Augustine? Partly, I just really, really like Augustine. I think he's just amazing, right? And actually amazing in the sense of, as I say in the book, when you read him, he sounds fresh, like he's talking to us. He talks about the rulers of his time as just mere managers and purveyors of satisfaction and economic frivolities, right? And you just think, that just seems to capture so much of what we deal with, right, in our lives, you know, that basically we have kind of politics as being seen as people merely managing economic preferences or managing individual satisfactions, right? And he goes at that, right? And he says that is not a true community. A true community is one with objects of love, and to his mind, you know, one that is oriented towards God. So there is a deep cultural criticism that I think that also echoes then what we're dealing with is this, actually, there is a fundamental dualism that images his earthly city to the heavenly city, fundamental dualism in religious liberty discourse and so on between those who would see it in a more liberal vein about personal autonomy and so on, and those who would see it in these more communitarian veins and so on. To the arguments around finis, I think, yeah, I think, look, if my finis section is one of those instances where I think I wish I could reverse the order of how I wrote it. Because my basic point with finis is that I think there's a lot to be gained out of finis. But I think that my argument is that religious liberty won't survive in a culture and a political community that has no commitment to religion, that has no commitment to this as a higher end. And on Finis's account, that's not there because he accepts this fundamental differentiation, which the church has quite a limited role, as against secular reason, which is what we do ordinarily, applying the principles of practical reason. And then that means he has a limited understanding of religion as a particular good, you know, to the point where one of his critics says on Finis's account, you can choose to play golf rather than go to mass, and you're not hindering the basic good of religion, right? So it's more that it's constraint. I absolutely accept that Finis does not. I absolutely accept that Finis is not in any way saying the same thing as, you know, Christopher Eisenberger and Lawrence Sager and various others in the liberal egalitarian account. In fact, he's quite clear he's opposed to that. Yeah, I think your master cake piece shop. I'm getting the naming of it wrong. Anyway, the case to do with the, you know, should he bake the cake? It's a really interesting one for Finis because it's precisely raises the point you say. On Finis's account, all you could argue in response to that case is that the legislation itself will go back even further, right? The passage of same-sex unions in itself is contrary to the basic good of marriage. At which point, if you lose that, that's it. There's no sort of rapprochement. There's no sort of coming together that could take place. There's no sort of plural difference that could, I think, arise at that point. Now, there was one other point on yours, I think. No, I'm talking about the ideal of true religion. Oh, about the atheist organization committed to eliminating superstition and so on. Look, as I've made clear, like my whole argument is couched within a general concern for associational life. How do we associate well? So there is and this goes to a point Daniel makes as well, about how do we start rejuvenating associational life? You know, a lot of this is in the background of this is things like Citizens United, Citizens UK, which is, you know, groups that focus on arguing for living wages, or things like the neighborhood program in the Church of England, or things that you get in just different local communities in which they're actually engaging in forms of solidarity together, right? Forms of mutualism in corporations and so on. And take like Citizens UK, you get on the living wage campaign, you can get on the stage at the same time, you can get the Roman Catholic Church and an LGBT organization, and they're focusing on goods in common, right? How they understand to pursue goods in common. And so I think there's always elements at just that political level where you can engage together on things. Now, to your specific point about, well, as a matter of religious liberty, then I think I probably lean towards saying no. Maybe we think about association, and maybe we think about, generally speaking, what's the rationality of a law that would limit such an organization. I mean, I'm not opposed to those sorts of arguments, but if we think religious liberty is fundamentally about that quest, that pursuit, when God matters, then I don't actually think that the atheist organization that wants to dismantle the superstition of religion, that doesn't fall within the parameters of what I'm saying. If we identify the good as what I articulate, then you've got to find some other basis for supporting that organization, I think, because the point is to shape a society in line with this. That doesn't mean that other people, don't have a principle of toleration. We should be magnanimous and always tolerant and so on. But there's things that I'm saying you privilege. In this case, in a society that's concerned with religious liberty, this is what we're privileging. I love your points about this being subconsciously reading as a Catholic. Yeah. What is post-liberalism? I think this is so interesting. So a lot of this debate could be overtaken by different ways of people thinking about post-liberalism now. So I wrote this over a period of time. And over that course of time, you now get different people claiming a post-liberal label, including very much so, say, Catholic integralists, a figure like Adrian Vermeule at Harvard. So this is not an integralist. It does have integralist elements, but it's not an integralist project. I don't talk about using civil power for the coercive ends of the church, for example. Whether we should use its coercive power of the state to force people to remain true to their baptismal vows, for example, that sort of thing. And I really liked what I think you said, which is this actually like an alternative modern, which I think that's right. I think that's right. It's especially in the case when you turn to personalism, the personalist understanding, and someone like Jacques Maritain. Personalism has like a romantic notion to it, right? A romantic sense of the creativity of the person, the creativity of that person in relationship with other people and forming associations. And that's like an alternative modernity that runs through it as well. And you can also point to there, like when you did social gospel, I say the social pluralist account as well, figures like John Neville Figgis and so on, where there's liberal thought within there, but it's not liberalism. It's more like a form of Christian socialism, right? That runs through. And you're right that it then has that response to neoliberalism, I think. Is Singapore Augustinian? That's a question for the Singaporeans, I think. I find I've read a little bit of Jacqueline Neo's writing on a non-liberal secular religious liberty, and that would raise a really interesting question as to whether the secularity she refers to is still haunted by this sort of half-concealed theology that I'm discussing. Yeah, I'd have to think about. I don't know if. I mean, I guess with Augustine, there's still an anti-statist element, right? It's not about just simply the center, because he does have that overlapping jurisdictions that is going on, which goes the role and place of the state. And then you said about the adjudication, who gets to decide these questions. Really interesting question. I'm not actually, my book doesn't actually answer how much I think courts should be involved in religious liberty questions. I sort of park that question, and I allude to saying I have some suspicions that courts are too involved. My point is to try and cast what is like the political imaginary for religious liberty. I've written elsewhere about how I think questions of proportionality that we do in religious liberty adjudication are often sort of normative assessments that draw on these kinds of narratives we're talking about. And ideally, these should be just sort of debates that we as people engage with each other and form where we need to, if we form sort of partial agreements, displaced agreements, or compromises or whatever, but we do it actually as a political commitment. I think it's unlikely religious liberty survives if it's just simply a juridified notion. I think it has to be a matter for political, sustained politically. Is the last point here, just I hope I'm not going too out of time, but the last point, I think I probably am, aren't I? The last point I should discuss then, my relational definition of person. So what Daniel's referring to here is when I talk about personalist thought, I contrast it with liberal thought, where liberal thought sees the dignity of the person arising from their capacity to pursue something like individual authenticity. So this is how Ronald Dworkin talks about it, right? To pursue what grips you as right for you, he discusses. And I say that actually turns a person into quite functionalist. They're equally substitutable with another person because we equally are pursuing whatever grips us as right for us. And so we don't actually matter. You could substitute me for another person. Whereas on a personalist understanding, what matters is my placement in a network of relations because I'm a gift, or I have talents, or I'm a gift to those other people. I matter to those other people. And so, you know, in a sense, I say that this kind of instrumentalizes, as Augustine would say, it instrumentalizes the person, but actually makes it that I care about that person. They're necessary for me, or they're necessary for us. So I don't think it's not just about, you know, relationships of a particular kind, you know, marriage and so on. It's any form of relational living. But you do raise a really important point there, namely whether I do need to actually draw to myself as a matter of inner integrity in order to be that. And I think Ron Williams talked exactly in those terms, that you need to actually have a certain inner integrity before you can, or at the same time as being able to be relational with other people. You know, to give a really silly example, you know, Donald Trump's tweets were terrible because they occupied everyone's head, right? They meant that nobody actually had the headspace to deal with their own internal thinking. So I think that's right, and maybe I don't emphasize that enough, that there needs to be some sort of inner integrity as well that goes on there. I think that's me, I think. Is that me, Arif? Have I still got more time, or is that me?
Actually, let's have that as being you for the time being.
Okay, well, just to say, those are all questions about that. So, you know, all wonderful, pointing to just all directions of thinking and pulling me up as well on some important things that you know, could be clarified or needing to. But thank you both to Daniel and Si-Hon for those wonderful comments. Really, just wonderful.
Thank you so much, Joel. We have some questions that have already come in the Q&A. Actually, 3 questions from one of the attendees. So I'm going to invite the other attendees, if you have questions, please to put them in the Q&A. But before I just turn to those, and I know we only have a little bit over sort of half an hour left, so I do want to turn to those. Can I just add a little bit? And these are one by way of comment and a couple of short questions to you from me. But Joel, I'll give you the liberty of not having to answer these, because you can answer those that come from the attendees themselves. But the comment is just to say that I'd like to add to the you know, remarks that were made by both Si-Hon and Daniel, that I enjoyed the book. I thought it was written with a sophistication and clarity, and it really helped to articulate and explain this complex theory in a way that was, you know, digested, that was accessible, but with a very thoughtful analysis. So I appreciate the book for that. And let me phrase these questions very quickly. And again, I'm not going to necessarily ask you to respond to them, because we'll turn to the questions that are in the Q&A. But one is the question about the charity metaphor, particularly in religiously diverse contexts, whether that's Singapore or Australia or the UK or other places. Given that, you know, as you have said, and you say it in the book, and you said now, it draws from a Christian, or in fact, perhaps particularly Catholic metaphor. So how much can it travel? How much can it speak to these other sorts of contexts? The other question is, well, okay, 2 other questions. I'll do them very quickly. One is, which you do address in the book, but I wondered if you could maybe speak about it a bit more. And I think Daniel touched on it, on this boundary of communities, on how we construct it, and particularly how minorities within sort of the folds might sit, and how that is going to be dealt with in our public discussion, in our legal regulation, etc. The other is the most general question, I think, which is diving in some of the political theory. And I just wonder about what lines you would draw between your conception of charity versus just general communitarian accounts that are pushing against liberalism, whether that's a McIntyre or Taylor or others. You know, how is this different? Is the language of charity, what work is it doing, or how is it, you know, adding to that something? Okay, so that's me. But as I said, let me turn to the others first. And we have 3 questions, all from one person, from Marcus Leo. And Marcus has asked, the first question he asked is the following. You mentioned he's proposing this to go to Daniel, but I think maybe we'll give it to Daniel first, and then Joel, if you want to add some comments as well. But the question is addressed first. It says, you mentioned that matters of religious belief should be left to the public sphere for arbitration and discussion. How would this be achieved? And why would it be the preferred solution, apart from the fact that individual autonomies are represented? So Daniel, do you want to speak to that first, and then maybe Joel?
Yeah, sure. Well, I didn't say it should be. I don't take a normative approach here. So I think the question for me to Joel was, should the matters of religious belief be left to the public sphere for arbitration and discussion? So I'm just going to pass the buck to Joel.
Okay.
Yeah, look, I mean, I did say that. So I think partly this is drawing on, there's obviously quite a general turn away from questions of focusing on the court as the principal place for adjudicating, say, rights disputes. So you see this in the work of someone like Samuel Moyn, right? As well as others across the political spectrum, and for, I think, good reasons. It's not that these courts' decisions are often incredibly limited and don't take account of can't take account often of wider contexts. You know, so a debate around should let's take one like should an employee be able to make religious statements outside of work that may be seen by some as offensive, right? That's a real live debate in Australia. Now, that's a really large, complicated question that doesn't affect just one party in one case. And it's something that, you know, we can have some disagreement and discussion over. Now, if we're going to then as a matter of commitment to religious liberty, I think, like, you could put it all in principles in the court and so on, but I genuinely think that what you face with religious liberty now is what turns against it is a notion that it's a site for scoundrels, and so you kind of need to have a political commitment to it not being that. Yeah, so I think there's reasons both of the general constitutional kind. You know, what should be the role of a court in debating questions of rights adjudication, and then what should be, and then also then question about where do you gather a political commitment, where do you get a commitment to something like religious liberty?
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Joel. Let me turn to the next question, again, from Marcus. This one is, I'm going to direct it to Seow, since you've directed one to Daniel, and then there's another one coming there. So Seow, I'll turn this one to you. A key assumption, the question reads, says as follows: a key assumption in this discussion is that the state plays an active role in regulating or intervening in matters of religious belief. Given a hypothetical situation where the state is a minimal state that allows for individual autonomies without intervention at all, such as in the thought of benign neglect, citing Chandran Kathakas, and legal science, Tebel, could the existence of different religions be possible?
Okay, actually, I would like to hear Joel's answer to this, but I'll just say a little bit first. I mean, I guess it really depends on what we understand by religion in the first place. And I think the reason I'm going to hear from Joel is because he says quite a bit about this in his book, you see. I mean, for some, and when we look at others who claim to be religious, sometimes it seems that religion is pretty much a hobby, right? I mean, it's no different from golf, indeed. The amount of time spent, it doesn't regulate life, doesn't regulate speech, it doesn't regulate how you spend time and that sort of thing. So if that is the kind of religion that someone subscribes to, then I think the state can take a back seat. But if religion is all-embracing, is foundational to life, then I think that there will be practices of an individual that will conflict with what other individuals ask them to do, you see. So in that sense, I find it hard to imagine that the state would be able to refrain altogether from doing something. But I think it would be great for Joel to speak on this.
Well, Joe, you can't turn down that invitation. So anyway.
I think what Seow has said is quite right. Like I don't think that it's very hard to imagine this sounds very libertarian utopia, sort of religious groups kind of or people just going about their own business. And the only thing I'd add to that is that, I mean, you do get to the level again where part of this discussion, I think, is I hope it's enjoyable, because it's trying to say religious liberty, yes, it's doctrinal, it's got these legal components, but it's also about what kind of society do we want to live in? And to the interlocutor's question, do I want to live in that kind of minimalist society? No, not necessarily. That sounds like it has real problems to me, in which the point is about how do we discern and pursue a common good together? That's what I'm arguing in this book, as opposed to a kind of libertarian notion of persons being allowed to engage in their own freedoms, which I think has real problems of who gets to exercise their freedoms over other people. But I think Seow is the more substantive point there, yeah.
Thank you both. The next question is actually addressed to all three of you. And the question is about Finnis. So I'll leave you to decide, whoever wants to go first on this. But the question is, was there a particular reason why Finnis's theory of the 7 basic goods and practical reasonableness was cited as the premise of the discussion? It is, after all, a rather parochial view of natural law, not to mention the wider discussion on liberalism and the pursuit of rights. So would anybody want to speak about the reference to Finnis or the use of Finnis?
Maybe it's my fault, so I'll just say something quickly first. I mean, I was posing the question to Joel, so I think that's why he was addressing it. But actually, the account of Finnis in Joel's book is just a very small portion. So I think he wasn't using it as a premise for his theory at all. Okay, so I'll just keep it brief like that.
Okay.
And yeah, that's right. And it is in my book. And all I'd say to that as well is just Finnis is, as Seow's comments make clear, he's just a large figure, and often in legal circles he is taken as definitive for natural law thinking, even though some would see him as a particular branch of natural law thinking, right, as opposed to classical Thomistic thinking, for example. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let me come to, we have one more that's currently in the Q&A feature. So I'm going to just remind people, attendees, if they have more, to please put them in the Q&A. But let me turn to this next one. This one is primarily addressed to Joel. So Joel, I'll turn it to you first, and then if others want to comment, they can as well. If religious liberty should be ordered towards the true good and the idea of a true religion, might it be normatively desirable then for religious authority to wield temporal power to stamp out heresies, since these may endanger the community's pursuit of the eternal good, or true religion, I suppose? In other words, how do you avoid Vermeule's conclusion if you think about religious liberty in the way that you have proposed? Also, might a more liberal conception of religious liberty possibly be characterized as a second-order religious liberty of sorts, one which prudentially accepts certain compromises given the fact of pluralism, but nevertheless does not entail giving up the normative idea of having religious liberty ordered towards true religion.
So this is the sort of debate I alluded to within different, post-liberal strands, I guess, if you want to go down an integralist pathway. Can civil authority be used to stamp out heresies? And in my book, I discuss Augustine on this, right? So during the Donatist controversy, he does appeal to civil authority to coerce heretics. And he seems to be appealing to this not as civil authorities exercising their civil authority, but exercising it as members of the church, right? And the argument in the book is, along with others who have said this, is that there's a kind of, it seems to be this is fundamentally inconsistent with Augustine's writing elsewhere, that this is contrary to the church being a community of peace that is not separated from the state in a separation of church and state manner, but still is different. There is a differentiation from civil authority, namely it's civil authority that exercises coercive power. And when civil authority exercises that coercive power, it may do so with an eye to, with a mind to the city of God. So that means, for example, the exercise of mercy while sitting in the judgment seat. And so this is the debate. It's about then whether actually what you've posed in the question, Vermeule's argument, is consistent with Christian thought, right? That actually there is still some kind of differentiation in which coercive authority is not exercised by. So you wouldn't use coercive authority to coerce recalcitrant baptized persons, for example. Is that inconsistent with the churches still being a primary witness to some community based on peace or love? Right. That I think, while still being in some relationship with civil authority, that is civil authority exercising its powers for with its mind to the city of God, right? So some of that debate is in the discussion then on Augustine in the book. That's kind of like two branches of post-liberal thought at the moment. And it'd be fascinating to see how it goes. There's then the second part of it, I think, was kind of like a sub question on that, about whether maybe I was asking whether it's prudential to talk about religious liberty now, but actually in a context where you're in ascendancy, you may not. I think that may be something like what was being discussed. Look, I think it remains even, it always remains, even as a fundamental one, something we haven't discussed, but as a fundamental baseline, that a person cannot be coerced into religious belief. Now, there may be debates of what coercion means, but this is something that's accepted. And if I appeal to authority, if I was wanting to discuss this with someone, you can talk about dignitatis humanae. You can talk about why are we interested in non-coercion into the faith? Well, maybe it's because the faith requires a free offering of oneself as a response to the God who has reached down to that person. So there's it's actually embedded in the nature of religious belief that it must be free. And so you'd always have some element of religious liberty, right? Even if you didn't accept what I was putting out there as a matter of the more plural, capacious understanding, where I say you can have a Christian conception that actually gives liberty to others. So I gave the example before about JFS, the Orthodox Jewish school, who had to accept a student who was not seen as Jewish because he was Mizorti, so failed on Orthodox grounds. And then basically the Supreme Court made them accept him based on his self-definition, which they put in quite very sort of liberal Protestant terms. And I think if you had a Christian understanding of political association and community association, there is a deeper respect you can have for analogizing, which you can understand what that body of that group is doing. They are forming a body of people that is in kinship with God, right? And that means that they're going to have elements of definition going on. So there's a difference. There's a kind of having that central case allows for analogies, I think, to other religious traditions. And I think that can apply regardless of the state you're actually in. So that's how I think would address those points about heresy stamped out and prudential pluralism, as it were.
Thanks. Daniel, Sean, did you want to come in with anything on this question that we've just had? So no, Daniel, no. Okay, so then we don't have any other questions in the Q&A at the moment, but I wanted to, well, now I can maybe, Joel, invite you to see if you have any response to the questions that I did raise, but I also want to raise another one. As somebody who might myself be, I think, sort of somehow semi-post-liberal, maybe recovering liberal, I don't know. I want to, again, this is going back to the political theory thing, and it was a point that I think Seow made about what the book is saying about public reason. And while you are saying that this wouldn't satisfy those who are sort of committed to the public reason notion, I'm wondering whether we mean here, and of course public reason is strongly associated with Rawls. Rawls was one that articulated the idea of public reason. But I'm wondering about the distinction between Rawlsian public reason, if you will, if I could say that there's a Rawlsian version of public reason and a generic version of public reason, which is not as Rawlsian, because of course Rawls's public reason has been subject, the way he is defined, it has been subject to critique, including by Habermas and others. So is there another form of public reason, an almost non-Rawlsian form of public reason, if that doesn't sound oxymoronic, which is capacious enough to achieve some of the ends that you are talking about, that you would want to see?
Okay, so this is like the hard-hitting questions at the tail end of the matter. A bunch in there. So you're talking about, so I focus on charity. When you said it's a metaphor, I don't quite mean that. I mean it is a virtuism. It's actually what it means to pursue God is to to love God and love neighbor as oneself. But what does that mean in a religiously diverse context? That's really, that's an incredibly important question. It alludes to what we were just discussing before. How far can it travel? I try to address, the religious diversity a little bit in the 6th chapter, and I mentioned it there with a case like the Orthodox Jewish school. How far it can travel, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't have a huge knowledge of, but I have a little bit knowledge of, for example, Indonesia and their constitutional system after supervising a student for some time in relation to that, and their constitutional arrangement, which appeals to Pancasila, and it has the one God, right? And it seems very Islamic, but it's not quite. It doesn't quite articulate it. And I remember talking to a bunch of students about this and saying, it seems to me that religious liberty has to have a kind of working with the grain. So, how would you talk about it in Indonesia is not necessarily going to be the same as how I would talk about it elsewhere, because I'd have to do a lot more work to convince. But there may be analogies, so there may be analogies where I can take some of what's being said and transplant it. So I'm not sure it's just a one-to-one, sort of here we go, drop it in, we're done. I think that could be strange, but yeah. But you'd have to do a lot more persuasion on internal to the community itself. My contention is that Christian thought actually allows, much better than liberal thought, Christian thought actually allows for a kind of unity and difference, both pursuing goods in common while allowing for a sort of displaced agreement or difference as to how we do that. This is quite a consistent thread in Christian thought, actually, that relationship between the sort of the difference and then the unity of the body itself. General communitarian, how is this different from this? Yeah, this is actually something Joshua Neera and you raised with me as well. I think the difference is that this is just much more theological in some ways. There's a few differences. I mean, probably some of it is communitarian accounts could be sometimes more about the specifics of that tradition, right? So whereas this is about more like, how do we understand society as such, as an effort together. So what is the ends of society? What is our common good together? And then how that filters down, or not filters down, that sounds a bit wrong, how it's played out in multiple spheres. There's much more emphasis now in post-liberal thought, I guess, on a kind of politics of paradox people talk about. You know, so you'll have, there'll be certain social conservative threads, right? An emphasis on the family, while at the same time a radical criticism of current economic structures. You know, focus on mutualism within corporations, very anti-capitalist. So that's, you know, that has new developments, I think. And then I think the theological is a bit about, when I ask that question, what kind of society do we want to live in, or what's the good that we're pursuing together? It's a kind of teleological question that in the post-liberal thought necessarily rises to the question of God and our relationship to God. So you're right, it's not divorced from communitarian, right? It's definitely not divorced from that. There may just be, and post-liberal as well may also be something that's going through different threads. So it may turn out that it's not a great label, because it's got, you know, these different threads that are coming out. And the last one was about distinction between roles and generic public reason. I don't think Habermas is all that different in some ways, to be honest. I think like Habermas has this point where he also says, I will engage with you as a matter of civil society discussion, right? And then he says, but you nevertheless must translate yourself into the egalitarian ethos of equal concern and respect. So he says, you know, we used to have a theological referent for the unity of society, and he has this easy stripping away narrative where he says, we got rid of the unnecessary religious stuff, and now we have constitutionalism. And constitutionalism provides a unity, and that's a shared commitment to equal concern and respect. And we must translate ourselves into that. You must, as a new religious communities. And that's pretty similar to rules as proviso in ways, right? Like you're dealing with a civil society in which you then, somewhere along the path, you must. So yes, Rawls has conversations with Pope Benedict and so on, but he ultimately still demands that there is this sort of oblation at the, you know, the site of at that point. But if you're meaning something like a generic, now I'd be fascinated to know what you mean, because I think there are arguments that say, you know, you're not always going to throw out every single thing, right? Like every conversation you have, and hopefully a lot of what I've written is not just someone has to share. Does someone have to share metaphysical and theological commitments to agree with everything I've written? Hopefully not. Like, you know, someone like Nicholas Walterstoff will say, you can always have partial agreement, right? And, you know, there's always things that we're sort of looking at together, like case law, you know, various texts and things. And then the other thing that happens, I think, and it sort of echoes public reason, is that we still have to engage in a certain, one of my old supervisor referred to it as decorum, you know, an old Roman virtue of decorum. You must know the terrain of the debate, and you can't just jump into an argument and go, well, here I am, and smash and bash and dash, right? You have to actually know what is appropriate to your audience, and know what is persuasive in a particular context, and know what is useful and tactful and whatever. So you don't necessarily, every conversation doesn't begin with, you know, well, let me start with the first cause, or, you know, it doesn't begin necessarily with whatever else, you know. It has to be, it's more polyvalent than that, I think. So that's a kind of public reason, which I think is just normal, and actually part of what you should do as a person who's respectful and exercises a kind of civil virtue. Yeah, so if that's what you mean by generic. And my hope, and I say this in the book in chapter 1, my hope is that people when they read this, even if they don't have various commitments, it does sort of echo something that's almost pre-rational or pre-reflective, or that desirable, you know, Alistair McIntyre once argued that he thinks, people are proto-Aristotelians by nature. They all think that their lives are ordered towards an end. And so this is similar saying, if that's the case, this is what I'm laying it. I'm trying to unpack that a little bit. Anyway, I hope that captures something of the generic public reason, but maybe not.
Sure. I mean, it's something we can keep talking about later on. Let me, since we only have a few minutes left, let me just see if there are any final either comments or questions, either Daniel or there are no more that are in the Q&A feature. So I don't know if Daniel or Sean wants to leave any final questions or comments, and then we'll give the last word to Joel, and then we can. Daniel, anything from your side?
I was just wondering about the one of the questions by Marcus, where he referred to finis as parochial. I thought that was quite interesting, and I think the definition of parochial itself, I think it would be contested. I think in the in a post-liberal setting, or in the Augustinian order, in which the public reason does not preclude so-called parochial religious views from coming into picture for a debate. So I would question the very notion of parochialism. Yeah.
Thanks, Daniel. Sean, anything that you want to add? Or if final thoughts, comments?
Yeah, maybe I just thought that I mean, I'm just quite troubled by the understanding of religion, that will be contested, in a sense that it's very much one that is, it's assumed as one that acknowledges the existence of a supreme being. And in that sense, I can imagine that, if pantheism is around, and then what is the line between pantheism and going one step to say that I'm an atheist, I'm the master of my own fate, I define my own destiny, I'm God, and does that shift it away from a plain atheism to something more religious, if I define my own destiny. So I think it's something that is at the back of my mind more than anything, but I guess something we can talk about over time.
Thanks, Sean. Joel, just a few minutes left, but so we'll give the final word to you. Anything you want to say, either in response to what you've just heard, or final thoughts to end us off with?
Just on both of those, I mean, it's interesting, Daniel's point about parochial. I mean, my impression, Seow, was that finis has quite a like many scholars, has a large reach, right? As in, it's not just so you're obviously familiar with his work, right? He's not parochial in the sense of he's just sitting up in an Oxford office by himself, sort of thing. So but parochial could mean his understanding of natural law, maybe, or but it's interesting to think on those, to bring those comments together and think about the comment about what do you do with difference and so on, and think, well, and then Daniel saying about Augustine, that the Christian thought actually has always claimed itself to be, or the church has always claimed itself to be kind of like a true cosmopolis. So it's not actually just located in one place, but it actually then has to be it's located in multiple places, and that means that you have variations when you go to different locations around the world and whatever, but actually still there must be some echo always as well. So that I'm not answering any point here. I'm just raising it's a fascinating thing to think through about what do you mean when you take Arif's comment about how does this thought travel. Really that question does echo that sort of discussion as well, perhaps. That's and to Seow last point about the pantheism and so on, it really is interesting with these cases that when you go back and look at which ones are sort of turning points, right? And for Roland Dworkin, Seeger and Walsh in the United States are real turning points. Seeger and Walsh are conscientious objection cases based on a view that was not rooted in any sense of the divine, but their own ethical understandings and so on. And then Seeger and Walsh immediately were, when they're applied more in pantheistic contexts by lower courts. But he sees that as a kind of like, it's for him a bit of a fulcrum towards, talking about ultimate concern and then the individual's authenticity and so on. So it does, those things track a bit, what you're saying.
Great. Well, we are, I think there's only like a minute remaining in time. I don't see any other questions. So I think we can maybe bring this all to a conclusion that, Joel, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for your answers. And thank you very much for writing the book that allowed us to have the discussion. Dennis, thank you so much for your comments on the book, and thanks to all the participants.